Good morning, it's Wednesday, the 6th of May. This is Europe Today, and I'm Marit Gwyn, coming to you live from Brussels with the news and analysis to start your day. Coming up on today's show, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio said last night that the US had concluded its operations in Iran and would shift its focus to the situation in the Strait of Hormuz. Hours later, President Trump said the US would pause Project Freedom, its two-day operation to free stranded vessels from the strait due to, quote, great progress in efforts to strike a deal with Iran. And Romania's pro-European government has collapsed after the Prime Minister lost a no-confidence vote yesterday, triggering fresh political uncertainty. In Slovenia, a second round of coalition talks is due today, with former Prime Minister Janez Janša saying the foundations of a coalition deal have been laid, raising the prospects of his return to power. We'll bring you more details on both those stories. In other news, Russia has launched strikes on 5 regions of Ukraine, including a heavy glide bomb attack on Zaporizhzhia and Kramatorsk. At least 27 people have been killed, according to local authorities. Zelensky condemned the strikes as a, quote, absolutely cynical terrorist attack. The attack came hours before a ceasefire proposed by Zelensky was due to take effect. But first this morning to our top story, because the US will pause its efforts to guide ships through the Strait of Hormuz, according to President Trump. But hours before that announcement, Secretary of State Marco Rubio had suggested that the US's military operations in Iran had concluded.
Operation Epic Fury is concluded. We achieved the objectives of that operation. I'm not going to, we're not cheering for an additional situation to occur. We would prefer the path of peace.
For more, I'm joined in the studio this morning by our correspondent, Stefan Grobe. Good to see you, Stefan.
Good morning, Marit.
So this announcement overnight came as quite a surprise. Bring us up to speed.
Yes, it's another day and another surprise announcement of President Trump. And as usual, it's lacking details. But here we are. And here's what President Trump said verbatim. Based on the request of Pakistan and other countries, the tremendous military success that we've had, we have mutually agreed that while the blockade will remain in full force and effect, Project Freedom will be paused for a short period of time to see whether or not the agreement can be finalized and signed. So what does that mean? Well, it will fuel optimism that the diplomatic effort led by Pakistan to end the conflict is still alive. Of course, we don't know whether or not there has been any progress lately and whether Iran is willing to go along. But when exchanges of fire between the Iranian and US forces in the Strait of Hormuz on Monday did not reignite the war, it signaled that both sides are willing full-scale fighting to end. And that is the situation in the Strait, Marit.
And Stefan, briefly, what has been the Iranian response to this announcement from Trump overnight?
Well, following Trump's announcement, Iran touted the U.S. failure to achieve its objectives in the so-called Project Freedom in a statement on INSA, that's a state-run media outlet. The statement further said Trump called off the operation because of warnings and firm positions from Iran. Now, as it stands, Iran's hardline leader are in firm control of the situation, and they want to make people believe that they are the masters of the situation in the Gulf right now. And what happens next may depend on whether Trump and Iran are prepared to offer each other a face-saving exit, Marit.
Okay, Stefan, thank you so much. And of course, we'll be keeping an eye out for developments on that story throughout the day here on Euronews. But now moving on, the International Monetary Foundation has said that Europe needs to harden its economy to a more adverse global environment. In a report released yesterday, the institution also warned that the war in Iran poses a serious headwind to economic growth. It said that in the most severe downside scenario, the Eurozone could edge closer to a recession. Now, joining me in the studio this morning to discuss more is the author of that report, Helge Berger, who is the Deputy Director of IMF Europe. Good morning, sir. Really good to have you.
Good morning, Matt.
We know that there's still major uncertainty over the situation in the Middle East and in Iran. But as you see things this morning, what is the economic outlook now for Europe?
Well, when we started thinking about the outlook first, early in the year, we thought we would be upgrading growth in Europe, especially for the Eurozone. That's not what happened. With the outbreak of the war and the higher energy prices, things have taken a turn to the worse. So currently we think that growth will be around 1.1% this year and 1.2% next year, significantly lower than what we initially expected. This is because consumers feeling the pinch in their budgets, they're spending less, investors have a higher cost of doing business, so they're more careful.
And in the worst case scenario, because you talk about the most severe downside scenario in your report, you said that the Eurozone could also edge closer to a recession. Is that an increasing possibility now?
We're certainly accumulating downside risk, but how far this will go depends on the war, and that's anybody's guess. The upside for Europe is that it has become much more resilient in terms of renewable production and the part of renewables in the energy mix. So any increase in energy prices, while still bad for the economy, isn't as bad as it used to be.
I'll come to that point of resilience in just a bit, but I want to ask you about the response of European governments and the policies they've introduced. Have they properly weighed the costs of these interventions?
It's difficult, right? So on the one hand, you want to help households. On the other hand, if you do it the wrong way, you dampen the price signal that comes from higher oil prices and energy prices, and people will stop saving energy. So you want to target the support. You want to go to the vulnerable households and help them directly where it hurts, but you don't want to sort of do more damage than good with these kind of measures.
And have those measures been targeted enough, would you say, in general?
Well, governments are trying. It's usually a mix of good and bad policies, but most governments have in some way or the other tempered with the energy prices, which is not the way it should be going. So as time passes, if the situation continues, we need to be more targeted.
Okay, and you also mentioned in that report that Europe needs to harden its economy in a world of a series of shocks, in a more volatile world. How feasible is that, do you feel, when so many governments are seeing a big fiscal squeeze?
Well, you know, the countries in Europe will need to reform under pressure. That's just how it works, and Europe is usually quite good at this. So we need to make progress. We need to deal with the single market, which is still much more fragmented than we would like it to be. Lots of trade, lots of activity stops at the national border. That's not what we want. Think about electricity. A unified electricity market would do wonders for the European economy. Prices would be lower. They would be less volatile. That is the way to go. Makes the European economy more resilient and growing faster in an adverse world.
And very briefly to close, we know there's also a big issue of Europe's competitiveness in the world right now. You did flag in that report yesterday some small concerns over some measures, including the Industrial Accelerator Act, this new measure to shield homegrown industries.
Industrial policy has a role to play, but it's very limited, where markets fail and governments need to step in. But it's not a cure-all. If you want to lift productivity, if you want higher growth, more resiliency, you have to go and do the hard reforms that help the labor market, help the product markets. And as I said, the single market, especially for electricity, energy, would do wonders for the European economy.
Okay. Helge Berger, thank you so much for joining us in the studio this morning and for all your insights.
A pleasure.
Now, we're moving on now because Romania's pro-European coalition government has been toppled after Prime Minister Ilie Bolojan lost a no-confidence vote yesterday, plunging the country into renewed uncertainty and raising fears of a fiscal crisis. For more, we can cross over now to Bucharest and to Euronews' Andra Diaconescu, who's standing by for us this morning. Andra, good to see you. So the government has been toppled. What's next now for Romania?
Good morning from Bucharest. Now the President Nicu Șordan has the floor because he needs to host all the talks with the political parties. He has urged all the political parties to do a coalition, pro-European one. And this is now the impossible situation because Ilie Bolojan party has just decided yesterday evening that they will go to opposition. So now 4 of the pro-European parties in Romania need to do this coalition as the president has urged, but two of them, one Ilie Bolojan's party, are deciding that they are not going to do that. So it's a long period of instability here in Romania, of course, with the society facing economic crisis, a very, very low leu, besides euro, and of course, political instability.
And Andra, very briefly, the AUR party, the far-right party, also filed this motion of censure in collaboration with the left-wing socialists. What are their next moves from the far-right?
Well, they had a lot of gaining before doing this motion against the government, and of course they gained a lot of likes, as they were saying on Facebook yesterday. So now they are playing everyone. We are really looking into how they are going to do their cards in the next days, because they are saying that they can go with the Prime Minister, and they can propose, of course, to do the government at the Cotroceni Palace. But again, Nicu Șordan has said that he doesn't want a government against EU. He wants a pro-European one.
Okay, Andra, in Bucharest for us this morning, thank you so much. Now, another EU country fighting a political deadlock is Slovenia. A knife-edge election in March delivered an inconclusive result, despite the ruling Liberals initially claiming victory. Now, former Prime Minister Janez Janša is hinting that he could form a coalition government. For more, we're joined by Alia Pengov-Bitenk, a Slovenian political analyst and journalist. Really good to have you with us this morning. Tell us first, how likely is it in your view that Janez Janša could return to power?
Good morning, and thank you for having me. To answer a question, it is highly likely. He seems to be the only one able to command something akin to a majority in the parliament, as shaky as that majority will probably turn out to be.
And so what would that mean then for Slovenia, as you mentioned, a shaky majority, and for the European Union as well?
Well, in terms of European Union, I suspect not much. Janša was something of a player in his last stint as Prime Minister, not in the least on account of Viktor Orban being in power in Hungary. And now that that has changed recently, he has lost one big potential ally. As far as Slovenia is concerned, there are, of course, challenges. The draft coalition agreement that was sort of endorsed yesterday points those out. However, the narrative that is spreading within the Janša, rather right-wing circles in Slovenia is something quite different, and it seems to be rather suspects a return to bashing NGOs and public media, probably even academia this time around. So we might get a little bit of reform-oriented official policies and a lot of right-wing populism unofficially and narrative-wise.
And very briefly to close, it was a very tight, knife-edge election. What has Slovenia, do you think, learned from that experience?
Well, first of all, the fact that active citizenship can go both ways. The turnout this was the second election in the row with a huge turnout, so that is encouraging. But also that, choices need to be made responsibly, whichever way the government goes in the end.
Okay, Alia Pengov-Bitenk there for us. Thank you so much for that analysis.
Thank you.
Now we're moving on because Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, is heading to Rome and the Vatican to mend strained ties, as Jakub Janus explains.
US Secretary of State Marco Rubio has a new mission. He visits the Holy See and Rome tomorrow. And as a Catholic, Rubio is the mediator after the fallout between Donald Trump and the first American-born pontiff, Pope Leo XIV. But what does it mean for Europe? Relations are strained after Trump publicly labeled the Pope as weak, due to the Holy See's vocal opposition to the US-Israeli war on Iran. In a bid to calm tensions, Rubio is meeting Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican's top diplomat. And Parolin has been a key figure in the Vatican's calls for peace in the Iran war. And as he visits Rome, US Secretary of State will also meet with Italian Foreign Minister Antonio Tajani and Defense Minister Guido Crosetto to discuss security topics. But there is also a bigger picture. After Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni defended the Pope, Trump questioned her courage and threatened to withdraw US troops from Italy. And it is no small footprint, as there are currently around 13,000 US military personnel based across 7 naval bases in Italy. And with US midterm elections approaching, the administration is wary of alienating Catholic voters, especially as the Pope continues to say that God doesn't listen to the prayers of those who wage war. And looking back at the rich and complicated history of European Catholicism, one could even say that coming back to the Vatican after a spat is the most European thing the Trump administration has done so far.
Jakob Yanis there. Now, Baroness Catherine Ashton was the EU's foreign policy chief between 2009 and 2014. Just before that, she briefly served as the EU's trade commissioner and brokered a deal with the US following a long-standing dispute over beef exports. Our correspondent, Angela Skujins, caught up with Baroness Ashton yesterday and started by asking her what advice she'd have for the current EU trade chief, Maroš Šefčovič, as he seeks to salvage the EU's fraught trade deal with the US.
What I would say is that it's really in the interests of business right across Europe, especially, to have some consistency and certainty about the markets they're dealing with. And we do have a president that sees the willingness of others to kind of talk to him about trade as both an important part of the conversation, but in a sense almost to weaponize it, to make clear that if we don't do things that he thinks are really important, then we can't expect the benefits. And it's very transactional, and he's always been very clear as the president that he takes that view that being a transactional president is the way that he wants to go forward. And I think that's really how Europe has to respond, or any country has to respond, is to try and work through that. It is very difficult because of the changing landscape. But in the end, this all comes down to the fact that with all that's happening, especially in the Middle East right now, we are moving to a time when there are additional issues globally that we're all going to have to grapple with. And so the more that we can work together on trade, the better.
During your post as the EU's top diplomat, you negotiated with Iran to temporarily curb some of that country's nuclear activities for sanction relief. You clearly know how to speak to the Middle Eastern country diplomatically. How would you currently assess the way that Trump is speaking with Tehran and the tenor from the EU as well in particular?
I think there's a different approach that's being taken. It's much more to raise the temperature rather than to lower it. And it's a bit of ensuring that there's a complete clarity about what could happen. So the critical thing seems to be to address the Straits of Hormuz and to find ways that you can get these open because of the impact that it's all having globally, and actually then start to build up a negotiation that can resolve the conflict altogether.
The UK could pay £1 billion to have greater access to the single market. We know that the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, wants to reset relations between the EU and the UK, but some critics have criticised this news, stating that it's merely pay to play. What do you make of this?
There's no question that Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister, and many of his colleagues have absolutely recognised that there is a need to get closer to the European Union and to Europe generally. That's partly because of the security and defence issues that we're confronted with, not least the war in Ukraine, but also the economic realities of the world in which we live. And I think all of this talk now about what money is, what should be done, how it would work, is really all about laying the groundwork for the summit, which is coming, I hope, in the next few months, where they can actually start to bed this down and make sense of it.
Our correspondent Angela Skujins speaking to Baroness Catherine Ashton there. But that's it from us today. Thank you for choosing to start your day with Europe Today this morning. Remember, we want to hear from you. Send us your feedback by emailing us at europetoday@euronews.com. And we'll see you again tomorrow.